In this video, we're going to look at some of the basics of object-oriented programming. This program is just a shell. It has a number of comments scattered through it, and we will gradually fill in the code that go with each of these comments as we work our way through the program. How do we declare a class, or how do you define one? And we do it exactly the same way we did with a struct, but now you know we can use the word class here. Then we give it a name the way you would normally do, and in this case it's called time of day. Then we have the curly braces down below, and we'll fill in the members. Since we're dealing with a class, we have to, at the very least, have public here with a colon, and then below that we will have the public members. Also remember from the last video with structs that we can include both regular variables and we can include functions as members of this class. We will start by looking at some very basic functions, and they have a special name that we will talk about. They're going to look a little unusual. The first one, let's type it in, it's just called time of day. And it has empty parentheses afterwards. And before I explain this, let's do one more. It's also called time of day, but this one has some formal arguments that are integers. Integer, hours, integer, minutes, and integer seconds. Alrighty, let's stop and take a look at these because there's a lot of new stuff here. We are calling our class time of day. Then immediately inside the definition of this class we have something called time of day with empty parentheses, and we have something else called time of day which has three formal arguments. These are functions, but they are very special functions called constructors. Every class will have one or more constructors. And you can have as many of these as you want, and strangely enough, they are all named the same as the class itself. So here's just some new terminology and new syntax that you can use with objects, and hopefully that will become apparent as we near the end of this particular program. I'm going to put in one more function here, and it's going to be void write, W-R-I-T-E, and we'll use it in order to output some information. All of these things, those are function definitions, and we have to have functions to go with them. So these are very much like a function prototype up here. Now, let's take each one of these and let's scroll to the bottom where we normally place functions, and let's write the code that goes with them. This one says function time of day, and remember we can also call this thing a constructor. There isn't much to go with this. It's just going to initialize some of the variables, which, by the way, I didn't declare those variables. I need to go back and do that. Let's go back up to the top and let's look at the definition of the class. I forgot to put in the private members. So private, colon, and here we have just hours, minutes, and seconds. All right. So we have some public member functions and we have some private member variables here. Now let's scroll down and write the function, which will be our time of day constructor. Time of day is, we have time of day, and it has to be bound to the function, bound to the class. So prior to the name, we need time of day with the double colon notation. And since this has no arguments, we'll put the empty parentheses here. Then we open up a block of code for the body of the function. Notice that there's no type. There's no type associated with this special function. Okay, the name of the function is just time of day. It's bound to the class by using the name of the class and these double colons, which is the scope resolution operator. All right, now this is only going to initialize these private variables to 0. Hours, minutes, and seconds. Okay, so that's all this does, and this does not have a return statement. All right, so this thing, we call it a function time of day, but it's a special kind of function. This is a constructor. So here is some object-oriented programming terminology, a constructor. Where did the variables, hours, minutes, and seconds come from? They're not passed in. There are no formal arguments here. We didn't declare any local variables within the function. Where did they come from? These, as it turns out, these are those hidden variables that are declared up at the top in our class under the private section. So scroll back up and let's look at those. Here, okay, this is where those variables come from. How do we initialize those? Well, that's coming up. Just stay with me while I type in these other constructors and functions. The second constructor is going to have 3 formal parameters called time of day. And in fact, I will kind of do the opposite of what I normally do, and I'll make a copy of this. And then I'll write the function. Okay, here's function, another constructor for time of day. Alrighty, so it's called time of day, and it has to be bound to the class, which is called time of day. We're repeating the use of time of day over and over again here. Okay, we see it in lots of places. Now, let's go ahead and add the curly braces, and let's write the code for this function. In fact, if I'm sticking with the example that you may have access to, I should change these variables. It's called, this is hours, minutes, and seconds. It would work okay like this, but to be consistent with the example in the textbook, I'm going to follow that. And the textbook uses init hours, init minutes, and init seconds. Okay. So the formal parameters then within the function are integers, and they're prefixed by init. This constructor is also going to initialize the private variables hours, minutes, and seconds. So I'm going to save a little time. I'll copy those 3 lines. But this time, instead of initializing them to 0, we will use the formal parameters that come in when we call this constructor. Init hours, okay, minutes will be set to init minutes, and seconds will be set to init seconds. Again, there is no return statement. This is another constructor. So it is kind of odd, right? We have time of day, that's a function. We have time of day, that's a function too. And we have the class itself is called time of day. Now, this follows the same rules that you would expect from a function. You pass in 3 numbers, then they're used inside the function to initialize the private variables, hours, minutes, and seconds. So these arguments are passed in, but these, hours, minutes, and seconds, those belong to the class itself, and we'll see how to use those coming up very shortly. The other function is called write. So in order to see the program work at all, we need to write out some information. So let's go ahead and write the code for this write function. So we'll scroll down. Okay, so I have the statement, the comment function write will go here. Well, this one is more normal, more what you would expect. It's a type void. it has to be bound to the class, but it's called write. But it has no parameters. All right. So here we go. So how do we write this function? The purpose of this is just to print out the time. So that's the only thing this is going to do. Alrighty, so the code for this, I'll make it look pretty, hopefully. Character, colon. So I'm going to make up some values here. I'm going to put a colon in between the hours, minutes, and seconds. So that's what this will be for. So this is a typical local variable. Now we just have a cout statement. So let's do cout, set fill to 0. So I'm going to put a 0. If I have my minutes are going to be a single digit, then I'll use this to fill in the other digit, making 2 digits for the hours, minutes, and seconds. Then we have the cout statement, set width to 2, and then we'll print out hours, and we'll print out a colon. Okay, now I'll do a little copy and paste to save some typing. Control copy and paste. So then I want to print out, set the width to 2 and print out minutes. Then print out a colon. Then after that, well, I'm going to print out the hours. Set width to 2 again. I'm sorry, seconds. Print out the number of seconds. Then end line. All right, so that will just print out the time. And since I set the fill to 0 here, when I go back to the main program, I don't want that to still be in effect. So I'm going to set the fill back to a blank before I leave the function. Okay, once again, there's no return statement here. It would be okay if we did have one, but it's okay not to have one. Now, let's go back and use these 3 functions. So here is the declaration of the class. We have 3 member functions, which we have written. We have 3 private variables, which are hours, minutes, and seconds, which somehow show up in those functions. Moving into the main program now, let's again bring in some new terminology. This says instantiate. So this is a word that's typically used in object-oriented computing. Instead of declare some variables, we instantiate an object. So you should become familiar with this terminology. To instantiate an object, one thing we can do is we can use the constructor to do that. We can use time of day. Well, that's the type, that's the class. And let's call it time 1. And let's set it to 5, 30, and 0. Okay, so that declares time 1. That's an object. We've instantiated an object, and it is of type time of day, and it has these 3 parameters. So when we are instantiating the object, we can initialize the object by putting the time in here. Now, let's instantiate another object, time of day, and call it time 2. This time, we will not put anything. We will just have a semicolon here. Now, look at the difference. We have time 1 followed by a parentheses, a set of parentheses with 3 numbers. Time of day 2, or time 2, doesn't have any parameters. By the context of this code, these 2 lines of code, the system understands which constructor to use. In this case, when we're calling time 1 with 3 arguments, then it understands that this is the function that's being called. This constructor is being called. It knows that there are 3 arguments, so it calls this one and not that one. In the other instance, we have time 2 is being instantiated. It has no parameters. So through the context of this, it knows that we should use this constructor here, which just initializes the private variables to all zeros. It is through the context of the call that it knows which of these constructors to use. Now finally, for this video, let's write out these two times. We have the write function, so it's pretty simple. We can just call the function and it should write out the time for time 1 and for time 2. In order to output the two times, we'll call the write function, but let's do a cout, double quote, time 1 is equal to, then another double quote, a semicolon there, then we'll call the write function. So time 1 dot write, and it needs empty parentheses. Let's also output time 2. Okay, so we'll copy those two lines, paste them here, and just change time 1 to time 2. Time 1, time 2, time 2. Now, this will print out the times for the objects time 1 and time 2. Notice we're using the dot notation to invoke the member function write. So that was explained previously in the previous video. So because write is a member function, which is a more ordinary kind of function, it is not a constructor, then we can invoke it just by using the dot notation. Okay, so time 1 and time 2 are objects, and connected to each object we have the member functions. To access them we use the dot notation. Well, enough about that. Let's go ahead and compile the program and run it. Here you see the output, and on screen we see time 1 is equal to 0530, double zero, time 2 is 000. So that was output. So remember, when we called time 1, when we declared time 1, when we instantiated time 1, then we used the three numbers to initialize the time to 53000. So when we print out time 1, certainly it's 530. When we instantiated object time 2, we gave it no parameters, so that initiated the other constructor, which set the times to all zeros, and that is what we see here. So we could close this program, and there's quite a lot. There's a lot of new things here. This is only part of the class that we're developing, but it just shows you a lot of new terminology and the syntax and how we can use these constructors. Let's go down one more time and let's look at these variables again. So when we called the time of day with no parameters, it invoked this. It set the hours, minutes, and seconds to 0. All right. Well, when we initiated it, instantiated is the correct word. This is the instantiation of time of day up here. These numbers, 530 and 0, those are used to initialize the private variables. Okay, so it is not necessary whenever you have a class that has private variables, you don't have to explicitly pass them into the function. They are passed along with the object that is of the type time of day. Okay, I know that's a lot of new stuff, but you are able to understand it. Let's terminate this video at this point, and we'll continue this program in the next video.